So, for the second part of my storytelling series on Patreon, I thought that I would try something a little bit different, which is to record a spoken word video rather than create a typed or text document. There's a couple reasons that I wanted to do this way. First of all, is that I always like to create different ways of interacting with my work for different access needs and for different learning styles, but also for myself, because speaking through things is just a different way of relating to my own thoughts than trying to get it written down on the page. Additionally, I find that when I'm typing, I hold myself to a much higher standard of perfectionism in a really unhealthy way than I do when I'm speaking, where I feel like I allow myself more of my own humanity. Whereas the written word can feel so final that I sometimes get stuck in the process of perfectionism. And then finally, my other reason is that white supremacy culture tends to emphasize the written word and see the written word as the ultimate way of sharing knowledge. And I'm really working to challenge that within myself with how I share knowledge, with how I consume knowledge. So I just thought I'd try this for today. It's something I hope I come back to, and I'm gonna really just try to act as if we're having a conversation, as if you're here in the room with me. I'm gonna try not to over script what I'm writing. I'm gonna try not to worry too much about silences where I take the time to collect my thoughts or anything like that. So thanks for being here and being on this journey with me. I wanted to talk more about my thoughts around storytelling. I wrote about this a little bit in Who Tells Your Story Part 1, so you're welcome to pause this and go back and take a look at that. But you certainly don't need to in order to be a part of this conversation that I'm having today. So my fascination with storytelling comes from my belief that we are all constantly on a day-to-day basis participating in the practice of storytelling, and yet we're often negligent about the power that comes along with that practice. And so sometimes we're either consciously or subconsciously yielding that power, and therefore we're not always as intentional or compassionate or honest in how we tell stories as we might otherwise choose to be if we were more conscious of the power of storytelling. So the way that I understand the world, and I went over this more in depth in part 1, is that we as humans don't have a way of transmitting thoughts or facts or opinions from one person to the next. We can't just think it into somebody else's mind. And so we necessarily have to put these understandings, these thoughts, these facts, these beliefs into some kind of container to pass it along to other people. And that container is always or usually a story. And so there are lots of different shapes of these containers. There are lots of different sorts of story containers that we can put these things into. And I'll briefly mention one container that I've been reflecting on a lot recently, which is the container of science. And so science is a container that we often don't admit is a storytelling mechanism. We often feel like science is that perfect, unachievable transmission of facts from one to the next. So, if you walk down any liberal or left-leaning neighborhood in America, you're likely to see a sign that, among other things, claims science is real. And so science is, in fact, a really, really strategic mechanism through which we try to name what is real. But science itself isn't real. Science isn't real. Science is attempting to name what's real. But I would say that the scientific method is actually a really brilliant example of responsible storytelling. So in science, we require multiple perspectives and multiple stories to examine the same facts. We require so much discernment and intentionality and responsibility about how we engage with the stories. The scientific method asks us to receive different perspectives, to look at it again and again and again, and to be very intentional in how we're transmitting these facts. But when we say that science is real, what we do is we empower people to deny that realness when science inevitably changes. It's beautiful that science isn't real. Because science isn't real, The world didn't have to stay flat forever. In COVID, we've seen, we thought we had to Clorox our groceries. We thought that we had to wear masks outdoors, walking our dogs. And these things ended up being perhaps not the most important parts of protecting ourselves from COVID. But if we believe that science is real, then how do we come to terms with science changing and updating as we learn what is real? And so I've been reflecting a lot on science as this really uniquely discerning container for storytelling, but as storytelling rather than fact itself recently. Science is a really special example because we've collectively decided to be really intentional about bias when we tell scientific stories. But we tell stories in so many other ways where we're not as careful about bias, and we're not as careful and intentional and discerning and compassionate and responsible. We tell stories about who we are as people on a very micro level. So I tell stories about where I come from and the journey that I've taken that has made me who I am today. I tell stories about what I did this past weekend. And these are stories because I'm telling them in a very specific way. I'm highlighting certain experiences as formative and perhaps dismissing others as mundane. And depending on where I am that day, what's going on, who my audience is, where I am, those details that I choose to include in the story or the way that I choose to share the details is going to wildly vary. And so stories also govern how we show up in our relationships, how we participate in our communities, the roles that we play within the different spaces that we occupy. So when we're working to heal ourselves, whether it's our personal growth journey within therapy, within ourselves, within our relationships, as a society, oftentimes what we're doing is we are rewriting these stories that we tell. And so there's a lot of research out there that I'm really excited to dive further into, showing the clinically therapeutic benefits of storytelling, the way that this idealistically intentional form of storytelling can lend itself to our healing processes. One aspect of this that I bring up a lot, I learned from Brene Brown, which is the phrase, "the story I'm telling myself right now is." And I employ this all the time. And it's a way of acknowledging the difference between the storytelling container and the truth that I'm trying to capture with that container. So let's say I perceive that somebody is upset with me. I don't know the truth yet. I know my perception and I know the container I'm putting it into. So if what I communicate, instead of "you're mad at me," I can communicate the story I'm telling myself right now is that you're upset with me because of X, Y, and Z. And that's making me feel this, this, and this. Then we begin to get closer to the truth and to a conversation about the truth by naming the story that I'm telling. And so we can see this play out a lot on an individual level, a lot on a one-to-one relational level. But what I'm really interested in thinking about with you today is the way that these stories play out on a macro level, on a community level, or a national level, or an international global level. And so certain stories show up again and again in our society. And we see these stories have the potential to be incredibly limiting and incredibly dangerous. We see this, in the story of the dangerous Black man, the story of the angry Black woman, the story of the Asian American who is perfect and yet perpetually a foreigner. We know these stories. We're having conversations about these stories, finally, thank goodness. But we see them show up again and again in the way that we tell the news, in the way that characters in television and movie and books are represented. And we've seen just how dangerous and deadly the consequences of these stories can be. But I especially want to highlight two stories today that we tell collectively that speak to my own lived experience, that I've been sitting with a lot in how I tell the story of my life. And the first of these is the story of the rags to riches meritocracy. The person, almost always a white man, who just worked so hard that they came from nothing and now they're something. They're successful, they have wealth, they have power, they have influence, they have whatever metrics of success our society values. And what this story does is it allows us to excuse ourselves from internalized superiority and privilege. We tell the story, my dad, my neighbor, my brother, myself had nothing. I was born with nothing, and I worked so hard to deserve what I have today. And so there's some truth when we tell that story. It's not a falsity. There is truth. I imagine that the people telling these stories have worked incredibly hard to get to where they are today. But it's not the whole story. And so this is where the responsibility piece comes in. It is true story. It is a true story, but it's not the whole story. And so then what happens, for instance, is when a Black person happens to acquire wealth or privilege or access to power, we point to that as proof that the white man's rags to riches story doesn't exist, rather than pointing to that as an exception to this rule. And so when this story is shown to us again and again in our media, in our literature, in the way that we talk to one another every day, the way that we introduce ourselves, the way that we talk about ourselves on social media, this rags to riches thing comes up on Instagram every day. I don't think I've ever scrolled through my Instagram without seeing somebody talk about how they were born with nothing and now look at how much they have. And so we're all subconsciously invested in this story and to some degree believe it to be true. And I think it's important to name that it is not true, but it's not the whole truth. And so another example of this is the story we tell of white women as victims, the white woman in distress, the white woman in need of protection. And again, here's a story that has some truth to it. Under a patriarchal society, women often are in need of protection, often are victimized, often are in situations of danger. But it's not the whole truth. And this story dehumanizes me as the white woman in that story. And it especially dehumanizes everyone around me that I've been acculturated to view as a potential threat to my safety. And we've seen this story used as a horrific excuse for violent acts all throughout history. The need to protect the white woman, or the perceived story that the white woman needs protection. So these are two stories that I've seen play out in my life, in my communities, in my society over and over again that have elements of truth but are not the whole truth. And really sitting with how we can tell these stories in a way that acknowledges the limits of that truth and that acknowledges the distance between a story and truth, whatever truth is when you distill it down. And I don't think we can take it out of a story, and that's kind of my point here with this. When we're put into the boxes of stories, we are dehumanized. That's unavoidable. Every single one of us is dehumanized when we're put into these stories. Humanity just doesn't fit inside of a story. So in the arts, when we consume art, we're constantly critical of characters who are flattened, who are cast as foils for other characters or metaphors for story development, rather than entire humans. But we don't talk enough about how this happens in real life as well. And so even really well-crafted characters in literature, in movies, and TV shows fall short of the full spectrum of humanity. Of course they do. And that's because each one of us probably plays the hero, the villain, the supporting character, the prop, and the foil within any 24-hour period. We're all moving in and out of these characters, or holding many of them at the same time. In different spaces in our lives, in different stories, in the way that somebody else tells a story about us, in the way we tell the story about ourselves. And we're so used to casting ourselves and casting those around us as one of these roles. That person is my hero. That person is a villain. That person is a supporting character in my hero journey. That person is a foil for me to achieve said goal. That person is a prop for me, or for this person to do X, Y, and Z. So we're constantly grappling with the fact that that's never going to be true, and it's never going to add up to the full spectrum and complexity of humanity. So stories are really dangerous, or they have the potential to be really dangerous and really dehumanizing. but they're also the way that we make sense of the world. They're the way that we create culture and shared cultural experiences. Stories are the way that we create policy and the way that we write laws and make agreements with one another about how to coexist. And so I really ardently believe that each and every one of us needs to be able to tell stories and to receive stories in a much more discerning, intentional, and responsible way. So what I'm doing in my work and my research is trying to better understand all these different approaches to storytelling and really sit with the way that we tell stories. So I'm looking into a scientific approach to storytelling. I mentioned previously that there's a lot of science around the therapeutic applications. I'm also really interested in the way that Western, European, and American storytelling mechanisms, such as the rags to riches story, the defeating or overthrowing the monster story, etc., actually really highly influence the way that we lead, tell, and understand our own lives. The book that I'm currently working on is highly autobiographical. I'm looking at the stories that I understand as touchstones or as formative within my own life. And I'm trying to examine how I tell those stories. I'm trying to examine what is my story and where I have responsibility to tell stories and where they're not my stories to tell. Trying to look at where I'm inherently dehumanizing myself, where I'm inherently dehumanizing other people in how I choose to tell these stories. Trying to look at where my sovereignty begins and ends within these stories. Trying to really understand my role within the story. And when we tell stories, we unavoidably assume sovereignty over other people in that story. They become characters in our story. And we're not able to see the whole of their humanity. And I don't know that that's avoidable, but I'm wondering what it would look like to hold in one hand the role that that human plays in our story, and in the other hand, hold an acknowledgement of their entire humanity, even if we can't see it. So if we're able to tell stories in this more discerning and intentional way, I wonder if we will be better able to collectively imagine the more beautiful world that we're fighting for and working towards. And so this is why in my work, I'm most interested in supporting artists. And an artist to me is anybody that calls themselves an artist, anybody that makes art in any way, shape, or form. I don't care if it's professionally, I don't care if it's, anybody who says they're an artist is an artist in my book. And I'm interested in working with artists because I am one, because it's the people that I know, it's the people that I've grown up around, but also because I believe that artists play a really unique and important role in this liberated version of storytelling. In the more beautiful world that I imagine, art is a cornerstone, because once we move past survival and subsistence labor, once we stop manufacturing scarcity and we create the world that I want to live in, what's left over? Play and creativity. In other words, the arts. And so my calling and my zone of genius is facilitating others in the healing processes, the embracing of their entire humanity, which I believe can be achieved partially through this sort of storytelling. A storytelling that recognizes its potential to limit and harm and dehumanize, but also a form of storytelling that embraces its capacity to liberate and heal and rehumanize.